Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
This week on To the Contrary.
In every nation or region, whenever there's a war, women go and occupy spaces that traditionally wouldn't do.
Women like that use their femininity, they use the status as mothers to push against repression.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from a variety of perspectives. In celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, we are profiling a historical figure who is sometimes forgotten by textbooks. Juana Azurduy was a revolutionary who left a convent and took up a military uniform in 19th century South America. She led thousands of indigenous and mestizo fighters and even led her own all-female troop against Spanish rule. Her tales of heroism include riding pregnant into battle, going away to give birth, and returning soon after to capture an enemy flag. With us to discuss her story are two experts, Professor Vanesa Miseres from the University of Notre Dame and Dr. Cheryl Jimenez-Frei from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Welcome. All right, so let's start with an answer that I think I already know the question to which I think I already know the answer because I've asked it about many women in many cultures, which is, why is she not better known?
Yeah, I think as you said, you probably already know the answer to it. Like a lot of women, her contributions were written out of history, that they were forgotten, and she's doubly marginalized because not only was she a woman, but she was also indigenous. And so the contributions that she had, which were great to the independence of not just Argentina, but Bolivia, this region, right, that was part of the Spanish Empire, was largely forgotten, even though she took a huge role in those battles. And so it's unfortunate, she died largely in poverty and forgotten. And it's not until in the 1960s through the 80s that there begins to be a movement to remember her legacy. And we see that a lot more recently in the last couple of decades. We see a lot more resurgences of remembrance of her.
And let me ask you this about riding into battle pregnant. When I read that, of course, at first I'm a little surprised, that doesn't, although we have pregnant women who are doing combat or combat related positions, it doesn't super surprise me because in her day and age, whether you were pregnant or not was your own problem. And if you were going to be battling the Spaniards or whoever you were going to be battling, you better be doing it even when you were pregnant. Yes or no?
Absolutely. Well, I would add to this that Azurduy participated in over 16 battles, but this act of heroism that you are mentioning, connected to her motherhood and carrying her baby and about to give birth, it's certainly something that was kept in history. One of the things that you mentioned in the introduction was the capturing the flag episode, and that one refers to it was in March 1816 when there was this battle, the Battle of Villar, and she led a cavalry unit, and she killed the Spanish officer and personally snatched the royalist banner from his hands. And this act of bravery led her to being promoted by General Manuel Belgrano, who was one of the leaders of the independence movement. He promoted Juana because of that to lieutenant colonel. So it's interesting, like Sherry was mentioning, that even though we didn't know about these issues for a lot of time. At the time, those acts were being recognized. And I have a little piece that I want to read from the records
Yeah,
that
please.
Belgrano is super surprised about her bravery, and he sent a document. He says, I hand over to Your Excellency the design of the flag that the Amazon, Doña Juana Azurduy, and he's using the Amazon title for her, captured on the Cerro de la Plata, about 11 leagues west of Chuquisaca, in what today is Bolivia. I am assured that she herself tore this sign of tyranny from the standard bearer's hands through the efforts of her courage and her knowledge of warfare. So it's interesting then to see that she continued to lead and fight in battle during 1816, and which is also the year of Argentina's declaration of independence. Even, like you said, while pregnant and her husband being beheaded, she later gave birth to this child, Luisa, who is going to be the only one surviving during the war. And her other children died of malaria and malnutrition. She continued fighting. So it's very interesting to see these maternal aspects being part of the official narrative that later in military history textbooks, like you were saying, were erased. But it wasn't the case at that time. And that's what I'm always surprised about whenever I study women from that period.
That point is so important, especially thinking about the status that Manuel Belgrano had at the time. He's recognized, right? And as, one of the founding fathers, the leaders of this independence movement. And most people do know Simón Bolívar. They know that name. And Simón Bolívar famously also reportedly said something similar about Juana after the battles were done, after Bolivia gains its independence in 1825, that he goes and he visits her in her humble home in Sucre, which used to be her hometown of Chiquisaca. It is renamed Sucre, and she goes back with the one child that's remaining, Luisa, and he visits her, and he reportedly leaves and says that Bolivia should have been named for Juana Azurduy or for her husband because they contributed to its independence. And so it is really curious and really fascinating, right? That especially for men at this time to acknowledge that, for these prominent men to acknowledge it. And then afterwards, she maybe perhaps the reasons that she is forgotten are varied, in part because she was a woman and she was marginalized and her contributions were diminished. But she also doesn't look for a political position afterwards, which a lot of these figures did, right? Independence leaders did later become part of government. She is not interested in that, in fame or a political position. She really just wants her pension, which she is later denied. She's given a pension by Simón Bolívar, but she's denied it, and she ends up dying in poverty and being forgotten.
I want to ask you too, both of you, Central and South America have sort of been at the forefront, certainly on pace with, I think, Europe, or if not far behind in terms of women country leaders. And I've been to Central and South America probably half a dozen times over many, many years of travel. Is she, or can her fans claim that because she was so out there and out front and not only going to war, but battling men, sword to sword to sword, is she the reason why women have become country leaders, so many of them in Central and South America?
I certainly see a connection. It was women who recovered the figure of Juana Azurduy first. In every nation or region, whenever there's a war, women go and occupy spaces that traditionally wouldn't do. But when there's a time of peace and recovery of the nation's stability, women should go back to their domestic space. And that is what happened at the end of the 19th century when nations were becoming more established or modern from a Western perspective. And it's at that time where women writers wrote stories about Juana Azurduy at the end of the 19th century. And I think they were trying to use her figure as a counterexample of what modern nations were expecting from women, of being domestic, being the childbearers, being the educators for future citizens of the nation without having rights for their own. So at that time, the figure of Juana Azurduy became very relevant and for these women to tell their stories and to set examples or counter examples of what womanhood meant. And these were the responsibles also for bringing back to the military profile of Juana Azurduy the maternal issue. They will portray Juana as a good mother, as a caring mother for her own children, but also for the soldiers. And that was an aspect that revised the hyper-masculinized ways in which Juana Azurduy had been portrayed over history. If you see her portraits or illustrations on the website, if you Google them, they will all look like portray Juana in a very masculine way. Every woman writer, every intellectual is always trying to build, I don't know if a genealogy, but it's a series of women who would represent their goals and their goals in society. And I think that Juana Azurduy, for instance, for contemporary feminisms, allowed contemporary feminists to find a model in the very birth of the nation. And I don't know if it's exactly connected to the fact that we have in South America many leaders, political leaders, but it's definitely a gesture that I see as continuing in Latin American history.
Now, do you think, I traveled to Egypt one time to do a piece on a female pharaoh who hid her gender for the most part when she ruled Egypt back about 1455 BC. So a lot longer ago than Azurduy was doing, running things, similarly in South America. But I asked one of the experts on the history of why was she written out of the history books? And he said, because who was writing history? There weren't any women writing history. And the men were essentially pretty chauvinistic back in those days, and even 200 years ago, and even today. So do you think things are improving for women? Vanesa, let's start with you. Do you think things are improving for women in terms of them getting credit for political and military actions that they've taken that they deserve the credit for but weren't getting before the last century or so?
Well, I think that's a battle that never ends. it's certainly something that has improved. Through Azurduy, I would say that we now recognize figures like another figure that has become, that we just are learning from or about in recent years, like Remedios del Valle. She was an Afro-descendant woman who also fought for independence and completely erased from Argentine history. And this is a very long and maybe other conversation about how Argentina was built around the idea of a white nation. And of course, that left behind lots of other profiles and people who actually fought for the independence and other causes. So I think, yes, through Azurduy and through all this movement of revisioning history, and revisioning history also from a gender perspective, had allowed to have more visibility, more recognition, and today, I think, or at least a sector of the society and scholars and students and teachers know, acknowledge that we cannot tell the story of Latin American independence without acknowledging or without recognizing the role that women and indigenous and Afro-descendant populations played.
There is somewhat of a through line that you can see in terms of strong women throughout Latin American history that have gone against conventions, especially in a very strongly patriarchal, Catholic, conservative tradition. Women like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in Mexico. She was also just an absolute rebel in the colonial period in Mexico, when, you know, women had one of two choices. They could get married and have children, or they could be a nun. And Juana Azurduy, in fact, you know, she was supposed to be a nun for a while, and she was, you know, when she was young, her parents both died, and her aunt who raised her for a time, she was very rebellious and she didn't know how to control her. She sent her to a convent to be a nun, and the nuns, she was expelled by the age of 17. She was too, she just wasn't fitting the mold. And so you see lots of women actually in Latin American history that emerge out of this, and maybe perhaps part of it is because the rules that dictated such a strongly patriarchal Catholic society were so strict that you do see these women that emerge that just didn't fit the mold, that weren't willing to fit into one of these two boxes that women were allowed to do. So I think it's very interesting, the question you pose. And there's also lots of women like the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina that were women that stood up against the dictatorship in the late 1970s into the 80s. And they used women like that, used their femininity, they used their status as mothers to push against repression. And in part, maybe because people didn't expect it, because they didn't expect women to do such bold things.
I would like to add here the political value, and I think that could be a difference if you go and analyze it. How women in Latin America have always given political value to motherhood, and like you mentioned the case of Madres de Plaza de Mayo, and while reviewing Juana Azurduy's history, I also thought about that if we venture to link this story of women in South America, there's certainly there a line in which women, maybe precisely because of the constrictions of a Catholic male and also military, because citizenship was tied as a concept to military. Those who could get into the military were the ones who could become a citizen. So I think that those constrictions led women to use motherhood as a powerful political tool. From the space that they were confined, they were able to make strong transformations in society.
Give me a little background in the audience too, please, if you could, about what was the scene in South America when this war, what led up to the war, what was the mood of the country, those sort of things that influenced what she was able to do with her life.
The wars of independence in Latin America break out amid the backdrop of the US American Revolution and the French Revolution in the late 18th century, all these Enlightenment ideals, people really beginning to think maybe we don't need a king, that there should be a different way. And so it's really amid this whole, these ideas. And the Haitian Revolution in 1804 is really inspirational. It's the successful slave revolt. And so in Latin America, you see all of these independence movements that explode amid this fervor, right? And so it's also very interesting with Latin American independence movements is it is very different than North America, the North American colonies. There's a lot more diversity. There are indigenous peoples who have mixed with Spaniards and Africans who are enslaved, and a large population of mestizos. And you have indigenous revolts, but also there are high commanders who are from the Criollo class, like Simon Bolivar, and who are more elite, so you have lots of people having a role in these fights. And Juana was really, she was known as this really great recruiter for the independence wars because she herself was indigenous. She spoke Quechua, she spoke Aymara, two indigenous languages of the region, and of course also spoke Spanish. So she was able to recruit indigenous peoples and mixed race peoples in these battalions that she led. So it's really this chaotic moment, and she puts herself forward and becomes this really courageous leader in that moment.
I would add that in the region from where Juana Azurduy is, there was a tradition of rebellions since the 18th century. So it wasn't unnatural, it wasn't a new thing. Of course, it ignited the independence cause, and everything ignited in 1809. But previously, there were several Criollo indigenous rebellions in that very particular region. So she was also, she grew up in this fervent context in which women also had played important roles.
Right, the Tupac Amaru rebellion and his wife.
Micaela Bastidas. Mm-hmm. So there were other referents. Like I was saying, like there's always like a previous example to follow, to be inspired of, and this set the basis for Juana's struggle as well.
How did the men react to her leadership? I mean, this wasn't a very liberated time in South America, and yet here she was pregnant and duking it out with guys. What did the men think of all that?
Reactions can be categorized as mixed in the sense that for the military, for instance, the military was always, women always participated of the military in many ways, but they were not officialized. Most of them were not. Juana was an exceptional case, perhaps because of her husband, but then also she gained herself a place. But that wasn't the case for many women. So for the official history of the military, women were rejected. Women were not, I mean, they were needed, but they were rejected in the official records. And but they also were accepted for the within the common people that needed women working, taking care of them, supporting the cause, and in fulfilling multiple tasks. So the acceptance, rejection has to do with your initial question of official history and how these women were forgotten.
It does seem to be, at least from most accounts, that her husband saw her as an equal, that he was very progressive for the time, that he didn't say, no, you need to stay home, is that he was okay with her coming into battle with him and that they would fight side by side. And that there were often women who would follow the troops, right? That they would be cooks or nurses, but it wasn't as typical for women to fight on the front lines. And so, but there were, this battalion of the Amazonas that fought with Juana Azurduy. So there were exceptions. And I think if we can go back to this question of the ways in which history is written and understood, and who has a say is something that is, what we're grappling with now, right? Is that one of your questions earlier was, do you think it's changing? And yes, it is changing and it's good. There is still some pushback to that, to asking these different questions about the past. And I think part of it is a misunderstanding about what historians do and how we understand the past, is that history isn't just something that we know and it's done, and we put it on a shelf and we're done with this. Just like any other academic, historians ask new questions, they find new evidence, and they come to new conclusions. And so now asking things from a gender perspective is that, yes, we learn a lot more. And so our understandings of the past have shifted. It's not that we're creating new stories, it's just we're uncovering them, unearthing them. And so it really gets to the fact that, we have to think about power in the ways that history is constructed, right? And silences, who has been silenced, and what role power has in creating our understandings of the past. So her story is really representative of, unveiling that, right? Is looking at the silences, and understanding the past from this much more diverse perspective.
Well, I want to thank both of you. You've been fascinating guests. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Vanessa. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Let's keep talking on social media, including X, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Reach out to us at To the Contrary and visit our website. The address is on the screen. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Frioff Foundation.
For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.